We're continuing our discussion of the interconnectivity of the world that we live in. Yesterday we were discussing how we are dependent on countries like China and even Malaysia and Indonesia, and how they likewise are dependent on us. And that is a wonderful thing. It comes with some trade-offs, like we talked about yesterday. You know, the fact that we can't regulate global trade in an effective manner. And so because of that, it has led to inequality on a global scale. Some entire countries are suffering because they're being taken advantage of. And so unregulated capitalism can result in abuses that we are seeing today. But yet there are so many positives of this global interconnectivity that we live in. Okay, so first off, a few terms that you'll see: internationalism, globalization, charter, and multinational. So once more, these are very huge concepts. But in this rapidly evolving world that we live in, as John F. Kennedy said in his inaugural address, we are now not just citizens of the United States of America, we are citizens of the world. And so that's what globalization really means. So you'll also see some terms like this: maintain, promote, mutual, because after all, these are part of the goals of the United Nations. So the United Nations is not a perfect organization. It represents our world, and our world is broken in many ways. And once more, this is just a representation of that. But first off, the purpose of the United Nations. Their goal, from its creation at the end of the Second World War, was to promote the common aims of the world's countries. If you think politics are a messy business, you're exactly right. But it's a beautiful thing when we can put aside our petty differences and work together for a common cause. And that's the whole idea with the United Nations, is to put aside partisan bickering. Do we really have to argue about guns? Do we really have to argue about blah, 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 XXX? But when you realize there are so many things we can work together on, and those things need solidarity, those things need cooperation. And this is the global representation of that. So, the United Nations is all about internationalism. That means involvement in world affairs, not just American. Global. Now, they started through a charter, which is a written document granting land and the authority to set up colonial governments, or a government document granting permission to organize a corporation. It's just an official document. So their official document was signed in 1944. The leading original members of this organization were the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, because these were the three leading powers at the end of the Second World War. By 1945, 50 countries had signed on, and the mission of the United Nations is to maintain peace, to develop friendly relations, to promote justice, and to find common solutions to global problems. Yes, we have to understand that China and the United States are very different. They have different economic systems, they're not a democracy, they have a whole way of thinking that is different than ours. But they face many of the same problems we do. They have to deal with the environmental effects of what they're doing. They have to deal with rapid population growth. They have to deal with limited resources just like we do. And if we can put aside the things that divide us and we can focus on the things that we can work together on, we can build a better world together. And that's, after all, the mission of the United Nations. So what are they like today? Today there are 191 members of the United Nations representing countries all around the world. They are in fact headquartered in New York City in the United States. You can go and visit the headquarters of the United Nations. It's an amazing place. There are flags from every country in the world there. And so, before the United Nations, there was an earlier attempt at something on this scale. It was called the League of Nations. Former President Woodrow Wilson came up with this idea as part of his 14 points peace plan to end the First World War. It was horribly flawed from the very beginning, and it ultimately failed, partly because the United States never joined. Even though Wilson came up with the idea, even though he was passionate about it, he couldn't convince his country to join. Now, the United Nations has had some success, but here's the reality. We don't have a world government. It may not happen in our lifetimes. It might. There are some who feel this organization is flawed inherently, meaning that they disagree with it fundamentally. And there are others who hope that this organization could lead to some common solutions. But a little about their story. The United Nations has been successful once more in solving some problems. We can respond to global catastrophes. We can respond to, environmental problems by organizing aid globally through this organization. But the real problem is, just like in politics, some people just don't want to work together. Some people say, I feel this way, you feel this way. Ugh. And so they can't put aside petty differences. And the unfortunate thing is this is the reality in our world here with the people that you live and work with. And this is even the reality on a global scale, is that some countries just don't want to work together because they can't be mature enough to put aside differences. But even despite that, there have been many successes. For example, if nothing else, the UN has created a place where North Korea can sit down in the same room as South Korea and they can talk like grown-ups. It is a safe place for people who don't get along to talk in a diplomatic way, and that's a powerful thing. This is where wars have been settled. Seriously, yes, wars have come to an end during meetings at the United Nations. Because just like a physical fight results from a lack of communication and understanding, so the two parties involved in a conflict might work matters out on their own. But occasionally, they've worked these matters out as part of the United Nations. Sometimes the United Nations will issue an ultimatum and say, you better stop this or else. For example, we've been doing this with international agreements. The Kyoto protocols, the United Nations came together and said, hey, we need to stop polluting so much. We're going to destroy this planet. And so nations agreed, not all nations. The United States didn't sign on it. It was called the Paris Accords, the Paris Climate Treaty. The United States has not yet signed on. But big things have been done. Also, the United Nations has funded special agencies to fight global epidemics. For example, the AIDS epidemic, the United Nations has been working toward a cure for that. Poverty, and even a need for education. But as I said, the big barrier here is what happens when you have countries who just will not get along. period. And you know in your personal lives that if there is someone you just cannot get along with, sometimes it's just better to avoid them. And unfortunately, it works that way on the big scale too. You know, sometimes France is just not going to get along with some other country. And they are just not going to communicate. I mean, even in the case of Korea, they've been in a state of Cold War for over 60 years. And they are just now starting to figure some things out. You know, just like you have friends who that friendship has severed and it's been that way for years. Well, don't worry. If you still want to reconnect with that person, it might take a while for those wounds to heal, but they might eventually. So unfortunately, even as a planet, we can be immature. The United Nations has taken an increased role in maintaining the peace around the world. For example, we send troops to the UN. You could actually sign up and serve as a member, a functioning member of the United Nations in various roles. They have worked to maintain and uphold ceasefires in countries. For example, in the 90s, there was a civil war in Bosnia between a group there called the Serbs and a group there called the Croats, and they didn't like each other for ethnic religious reasons, and the UN was sent in to basically just be that guy in the middle, to say, you go over there and chill out, you go over there and chill out. And it's called maintaining a ceasefire. They've also overseen elections. You know, one of the hopes of the UN is to promote and protect democratic institutions around the world, to ensure that everyone has a voice and everyone has the freedom of expression globally. And so they have been sent in to protect elections. You know, the first democratic election ever was held in Afghanistan in 2004. President Hamid Karzai was elected the first democratically elected president of Afghanistan. There were numerous threats, there were concerns about the safety and efficiency of the election, and the United Nations were there to actually make sure it happened the way it was supposed to. They've even provided humanitarian aid. About 6 years ago, I'm probably wrong on my dates here, but about 6 or 7 years ago, there was a tsunami in Indonesia. It killed over 100,000 people. It was one of the worst environmental disasters in modern history. 100,000 people or more were killed. And so globally, we organized efforts to go help. The United Nations works to keep globalization a positive force. Globalization means that if we can put aside petty differences, if we can put aside these ideas of extreme nationalism, you know, do we really need to be obsessed with American greatness? Or can we think bigger than that and cooperate globally? And that's, after all, what the United Nations was designed for, is to help us move toward globalization. And in many ways, we're already there. We are already cooperating on this incredibly complex economic system of trade that's occurring between nations all the time. I mean, there's the kayak on my car. It came from Germany. Yay! Finally arrived. Super excited. It's probably going to be too dangerous to paddle today, but maybe tomorrow. Well, anyway, I'm excited. It came all the way from Rosenheim on some freight shipment, and then all the way to California, and then all the way on a truck, all the way here. And then finally, met the guy in Asheville. Now it's on my car. Yay! You know, that is part of the complex system that is globalization. Well, what types of specific things have they accomplished? Well, at the Summit of the Earth in 1992, a conference was held to discuss environmental issues. In fact, at this summit, 178 nations pledged to take steps to protect the environment. A few years later, the Earth Summit 2 made some progress in terms of the details, but really we still have a lot of work to be done. Some nations are leading the way. Some nations have gone entirely green, meaning that all of their energy production comes only from renewable sources. That's a wonderful thing. But we're not there yet. There are political problems hindering that. There are economic issues still hindering that. We might be there. But yes, I have to admit there are some countries that are ahead of us. But globally, the United Nations are the ones working toward that solution. So in 2006, the UN attempted to make a global response to economic inequality. They conducted studies and found that the world was divided, just like our country is divided, into the wealthy and the poor. And even if you look at this on an international scale, there are, quote, wealthy nations like us, and there are certainly poor nations. The United Nations is a multinational organization. That means that it transcends national borders. But guess what? There are also companies that are multinational. Google is not just an American company. Sure, it was started in America, but it's much bigger than that now. Same with McDonald's, same with Exxon, same with BP, the British Petroleum. The same with so many of these huge multinational conglomerates. They have offices in many countries. And so, in summary, there have been many successes of the United Nations, but there are still many unfinished jobs. But it's an exciting, hopeful prospect that if you're interested in, you should look up their website and see how you can get involved.